In this video, I'm going to go through sections 14.6 and 14.7 in your textbook. So we get into reaction mechanisms. So the steps by which a reaction occurs is called the reaction mechanism. And the reaction mechanism describes the order in which bonds are broken and formed, and the changes in relative positions of the atoms in the course of the reaction. So the reaction mechanism is what we're going to use to describe in what order bonds are broken and then reassembled or formed, and then the changes in the atoms. So where are the atoms moving? Where's that nitrogen going? Where's that oxygen going? So that's what a reaction mechanism is going to do. A process in a chemical reaction that occurs within a single step is called an elementary reaction. Okay. So a process in a chemical reaction that occurs in a single step is called an elementary reaction. And so like I mentioned when we first started talking about this unit, is what we see in a balanced chemical equation doesn't always tell us the full story. Okay, that there may be intermediate steps within there that we are never even aware of that have to happen for us to get from the reactant to the product or reactants to products. The number of molecules that participate in this elementary reaction is called the molecularity of the reaction. If a single molecule is involved, so if we're talking about like a decomposition or something like that, then the reaction is unimolecular because it involves just one molecule. If we have the collision of two reactant molecules, this is called bimolecular. And if we have three, that is called termolecular. Now, these are very rare. Termolecular, very rare. So most of our focus is going to be on the unimolecular and the bimolecular. Those termolecular, where we have three different molecules that hit each other just right in the right orientation with enough energy to cause a reaction, that is very rare. The chemical reactions for the elementary reactions in a multi-step mechanism must always add to give the chemical equation of the overall process. And if a substance is formed in one elementary reaction and then consumed in the next, that is called our intermediate. Okay, so you've got an example here in your book. Okay, so let's look at this example. So we have nitrogen dioxide with carbon dioxide, and that's going to yield nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide. Okay, so in this reaction, we have two steps that are occurring that we don't necessarily see when we look at our overall reaction. And both of these are bimolecular. Okay, we have two nitrogen molecules that collide with one another to form a nitrogen trioxide and nitrogen monoxide molecule. So basically, an atom is transferred from one to the other. And then that nitrogen trioxide ends up becoming our reactant in our next elementary step. It collides with the CO, the carbon monoxide from the original, and then that produces NO2 and CO2. So we kind of go back to what we started with. So this is a two-step mechanism. And so when we put all of this together, it has to add up to give the chemical equation of the overall process. So when we put our original things that we're starting with here, so 2NO2 plus the NO3 plus the CO yields the NO3, NO2, NoCO2. Then we can simplify this and end up taking out some of the pieces. So, we can take out the NO3, okay. There's our CO. We've got 2 NO2s here. We've got one over here, so that'll cancel that out. So we've got NO2 plus CO yields NO plus CO2, which is our original overall equation. Okay, so this NO3 here that was formed for this first elementary step and then used as a reactant in the second elementary step, that is called an intermediate. And from looking at our balanced equation, we never even know that it's there, okay, because it's formed and then used up in the next reaction, okay. So let's look at sample exercise 14.12. It has been proposed that the conversion of ozone into O2 proceeds by a two-step mechanism, and they give us that mechanism. So we've got O3 gas into O2 gas plus O, and then O3 plus O gives us, actually, let me write that where the arrows line up. That sometimes makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so there's our proposed two-step mechanism. And so the first thing wants to know, what is the molecularity of each elementary reaction in this mechanism? So what is the molecularity? Well, I printed this, or I copied in this table from your book to kind of help you out and help you determine what is unimolecular, bimolecular, and termolecular, and then what is the rate law going to be based upon that. Okay, so I thought that this might help you with some of this molecularity stuff, and so that's included in your notes as well. So we have one in our first step here, we have one reactant. So let's just say this is our first and this is our second step. So to determine the molecularity, we have one reactant, so that is unimolecular, okay? And then the second reaction has two reactants, so that is going to be bimolecular, okay? So that's our first question that they ask us, what is the molecularity? Then part B says, write the equation for the overall reaction. So we need the overall reaction. So we're going to combine our reactants and combine our products. So we have O3 and O3, so that's 2O3 plus O, okay? And then we've got O2 plus another 2 O2s there, so that's going to give us 3 O2s plus O. Now, we look at what we have the same on both sides, and that's the O. So we're going to get rid of that because it's the same on both sides. So our equation for the overall reaction looks like this. Okay. So all I did is I combined my reactants with my products. and then canceled out the O because it was the same on both sides. And then part C says, identify the intermediate. Well, what was formed that wasn't in the final reaction? The O. So the intermediate is O. Okay. So not too complicated there. All right. Just trying to determine what's unimolecular, what's bimolecular, if you have termolecular. Okay. And again, you have this table to help you out with that. All right. Let's move on to our last page here. If a reaction is elementary, okay, and just as a reminder, the elementary reaction is the single step. Okay, so it's each of those single steps, and its rate law is based on its molecularity. So let's look at sample exercise 14.13. It gives us a reaction and it says, if the following reaction occurs in a single elementary reaction, predict its rate law. So we're going to match it to these elementary reactions, right? So it best resembles this one right here because we have two different reactants leading to our product, right? Because we have H2 and Br2. So our rate law then, we just plug in our A and our B, right? And so this is going to be our rate law. We're not going to have any exponents there. And so that is our prediction for this rate law. Okay. So that was the predicted rate. Now, your book goes on and describes a little bit here and says that experimental studies of the reaction show that it actually has a different rate law. And because the experimental rate law, the one that they have, defined based on experiments done with these two reactants, differs from the one assuming that we have just one step, then that tells us, you know what, this isn't the only step in that reaction. There are intermediates that are going to occur in this reaction. Okay. Now, you have no way of knowing that. So when it asks you to predict the rate law, all you're going to do is look at this table and form a prediction. Okay. You're not going to be able to know the actual one unless you're given data to determine that, and you weren't. So this is our predicted rate law based on what we know about the reactants and the products. Okay. Now the last section here we get into is catalysis because I'm skipping some of that in the reaction mechanism section. Remember, we talked about this early on. A catalyst is a substance that changes the speed of the reaction. It's going to speed up a reaction without actually becoming used up or involved in the reaction itself. And we need catalysts. We use them in the body. We use them in nature. We use them for a lot of different processes in the atmosphere, in water. We have to have a catalyst. So a catalyst that's present in the same phase as the reactant is called a homogeneous catalyst. So if we're dealing with solids and we use a solid catalyst, then that would be a homogeneous catalyst. If we use one that is in a phase different, that is a heterogeneous catalyst. So in the lab that we're going to do, we're going to use a homogeneous catalyst. We're going to be dealing with peroxide and we're going to use a solution of potassium iodide. We could just as easily use solid potassium iodide. It does the same thing. So it really doesn't matter. But what a catalyst does, or how it works, is that the catalyst is going to lower the activation energy. In other words, it's going to lower that barrier that we have to get over. Okay. Remember, the lower the activation energy, the faster a reaction can proceed. So if we use a catalyst and it lowers the activation energy, that's just going to speed up the rate of reaction. Now, when we refer to catalysts that are involved in biological reactions, these are called enzymes. And enzymes are actually specialized proteins. If we didn't have enzymes in the body, the reactions within our body would occur too slowly to sustain us. So we have to have enzymes in order to survive. Now, enzymes, when we're talking about enzymes, they're very specific. And so the reaction that a given enzyme catalyzes takes place at a specific location on the enzyme called the active site. And the substances that react there are called substrates. So basically you've got an enzyme, and it's going to have a particular location on it called an active site. And the specific substrates or the specific substances that it can catalyze are called the substrates. And we use what we call the lock and key model to describe the specificity of enzymes, just like the key that unlocks your front door can only unlock your front door. An enzyme that catalyzes reaction A can only catalyze reaction A. You know, my key won't unlock your front door. And an enzyme that's necessary for reaction B cannot catalyze reaction A. So these reactions are very specific. Once the substrate combines with its enzyme at the active site, we call that the enzyme substrate complex. Okay. If something else comes in and binds with an enzyme, then it can't do its job. And so the activity of an enzyme is destroyed if a molecule other than the substrate that is specific to that enzyme binds in there. And these are called enzyme inhibitors. Okay. So an enzyme can't do its job if something else comes in there and binds to the active site. So let me give you an example of this. So bacteria cannot get folic acid from their environment. Okay, so bacteria have to make their own folic acid. And so there's a very specific reaction that has to occur, or series of reactions that has to occur within a bacterium to allow it to produce folic acid, which is necessary for it to replicate its DNA. Well, we can manipulate that. We can inhibit those enzyme reactions by using an antibiotic that targets an enzyme in that reaction. It doesn't hurt us because we ingest folic acid from the foods that we eat. So we don't have that same chemical pathway because we don't make our own folic acid. So what we can do is we can take a particular antibiotic. You may have heard of Bactrim or Septra. And what that antibiotic does is that it binds to one of the enzymes in that pathway to make folic acid, and it shuts it down. It inhibits it. It can't work anymore like it should. The bacterium can't produce folic acid. Therefore, it can't replicate its DNA, which means it can't divide. So this antibiotic successfully gets rid of that bacterial infection by inhibiting the folic acid pathway. So if we know what specific enzymes are involved in a chemical reaction, we can inhibit that reaction in a way that benefits us, like in this example. But other times, enzyme activity is inhibited accidentally, by something that binds to it that shouldn't. And this can be done competitively or non-competitively, depending on what the overall outcome is. I hope that this has helped explain the rest of chapter 14 and helps prepare you for